The first time I saw the property, I fell in love instantly. 5 acres of gently rolling hills, surrounded by mature oak trees, with a small creek running along the western edge. The real estate listing described it as semi-rural paradise within commuting distance to the city. And for once, the marketing language was not an exaggeration. I stood on a small rise near the center of the land and knew immediately I would build my home there. The property was not without complications. It had no direct access to any public road. The only way to reach it was via a well-maintained private road that ran through Oak Hollow, an upscale planned community with an active homeowners association. My real estate agent, David, explained that the previous owner had negotiated an access agreement with the HOA years ago. "The agreement is solid," David assured me. "They cannot legally prevent you from using the road to access your property. It is what we call an easement by necessity. Without it, your land would be landlocked, which is not permissible under state law." Despite his confidence, something about the situation made me uneasy. I requested copies of all documents related to the access rights before proceeding. That night, I read through every page carefully and noticed the agreement granted access, but included vague language about community standards and reasonable use restrictions. The next day, I contacted my cousin Robert, an attorney specializing in property law. We spent hours discussing potential scenarios that could compromise my access rights. Robert helped me draft a special clause, paragraph 17, subsection C, to be added to the deed. The clause established ironclad access rights and contained specific penalties if the HOA ever attempted to restrict my ability to reach my property. "This is overkill," David said when I insisted on adding the clause. "But if it makes you feel better, we can include it." At the closing, 3 HOA board members attended as required signatories for the access agreement. Margaret Williams, the HOA president, barely glanced at the documents before signing them with a flourish. The other 2 board members followed her lead. None of them appeared to notice or care about my special addition. The first year of property ownership passed pleasantly enough. I cleared the building site, poured the foundation for my home, and began framing the structure. The commute from my apartment to the property took me through Oak Hollow each day. I always drove slowly and waved politely to residents, careful to respect the 15 mph speed limit posted on their private roads. Occasional interactions with HOA board members occurred. Minor conflicts emerged over seemingly trivial matters. My construction trucks left some mud on their pristine road after a rainstorm, prompting a warning letter. I placed a temporary mailbox at the entrance to my access road, generating another citation claiming it violated their aesthetic standards. Each time, I complied with their requests while carefully documenting every interaction. Then came the certified letter. I recognized the Oak Hollow HOA logo on the envelope immediately. Inside, I found a formal notice explaining that the board had revisited the access agreement. They claimed the original intent never included permanent thoroughfare access for non-residents. According to their interpretation, I was granted temporary access for inspection purposes only, not for permanent residence construction. The final paragraph delivered the devastating news. In 30 days, Oak Hollow would install security gates and barriers that would prevent non-resident access. My heart raced as I read the closing line. "We suggest you make appropriate arrangements regarding your property beyond our boundaries." What they did not realize was that I had anticipated this possibility from the beginning. The trap had been set a year ago, and they had just stepped directly into it. The certified letter weighed in my hands like a stone. I read it 3 times, making sure I understood exactly what was happening. The HOA claimed their roads were never intended for permanent thoroughfare access to non-HOA properties. They cited bylaws I had never seen and referenced board meetings I had never been invited to attend. The decision, according to the letter, was final and not open to discussion. I called Margaret Williams immediately. Her assistant informed me that Margaret was unavailable for individual consultations, but confirmed that an emergency meeting had been scheduled for property owners affected by the new access restrictions. The meeting would take place in 3 days at the Oak Hollow Community Center. Those 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I consulted with Robert again, who reviewed the letter and frowned deeply. "They are trying to exploit a perceived loophole," he said. "They think they can block access because technically why? O do not own property within their HOA boundaries. It is a weak legal position, but fighting it could take months or even years in court." "What about paragraph 17?" I asked. "Keep that quiet for now," he advised. "Let us see what they say at the meeting before showing our hand." The community center was crowded when I arrived. I recognized several faces, other non-HOA property owners who accessed their land through Oak Hollow roads. We exchanged nervous glances as the board members filed in and took their seats at the front table. Margaret called the meeting to order. She wore an expensive blazer and pearl necklace, her silver hair perfectly styled. Without any preamble, she explained that the board had discovered concerning legal exposures related to non-resident use of HOA-maintained roads. "Oak Hollow members pay substantial dues for road maintenance," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "It has become clear that allowing unrestricted access to non-members places an undue burden on our community resources and creates liability issues our insurance company has flagged as problematic." I raised my hand and waited to be acknowledged. When Margaret finally nodded in my direction, I stood. "My property is landlocked without access through Oak Hollow," I stated clearly. "State law protects easements by necessity. You cannot legally cut off my only access route." Margaret smiled thinly. "We are not cutting off access entirely. You will be permitted to request visitor passes for limited property inspections. What we are preventing is daily construction traffic and eventual permanent residence use by non-HOA members." "That effectively renders my property worthless," I responded, struggling to keep my voice level. "I have invested my life savings in building a home there." "Perhaps you should have considered access issues more carefully before purchasing," she replied dismissively. "Oak Hollow has development plans of our own that require securing our perimeter." That was when I understood. The community had expansion plans that likely included my land. By cutting off my access, they hoped to force me to sell at a desperate price. The realization must have shown on my face because Margaret quickly changed the subject. 2 weeks later, construction crews appeared at the entrance road leading to my property. They installed concrete planters, metal posts, and began erecting a chain-link fence. I watched in disbelief as they posted "Private Road, No Trespassing" signs every 20 feet. A security guard informed me I needed to move my vehicle or risk being towed. That night, I stayed with friends in the city. My home was now impossible to reach. The financial impact hit immediately. Mortgage payments continued, construction loans accrued interest, and contractors threatened liens for materials already delivered but now abandoned on site. Each night away from my property cost me money I could not afford to lose. I drove by the barriers each day, documenting the changes with my camera. On the 5th day, I noticed Margaret walking the perimeter with a man in a business suit. They pointed toward my property and nodded. Through my zoom lens, I snapped photos of them shaking hands before departing in separate luxury vehicles. Later that week, I received an unexpected phone call. A real estate developer representing Oak Hollow Expansion Partners LLC expressed interest in purchasing my now difficult-to-access property. The offer was 40% below market value. I politely declined and hung up, my suspicions confirmed. They had deliberately created an impossible situation, expecting me to capitulate under financial pressure. Instead, I began gathering evidence for what would become the most important legal battle of my life. With my property effectively stolen through bureaucratic maneuvering, I returned to the documents that had been carefully prepared before purchase. The deed contained standard legal language about property boundaries, mineral rights, and easements, but buried within these mundane provisions was paragraph 17. Subsection C. This was the clause that would become my salvation. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Davidson, had warned me about Oak Hollow during our very first meeting. We sat on his porch overlooking the property as he explained his decision to sell. Beautiful land, but dealing with that HOA has become too exhausting for a man my age, he said, sipping his iced tea. They have been trying to acquire this parcel for years. Their development plans show a future phase that would incorporate these 5 acres. Mr. Davidson lowered his voice. 3 years ago, they tried restricting my access, claiming road maintenance concerns. It took 6 months of legal wrangling to restore my full rights. They will try again with a new owner. Mark my words. His warning had not fallen on deaf ears. Before making an offer, I scheduled a consultation with attorney Richards, who specialized in property disputes and easement laws. His office walls displayed numerous certifications in real estate law. This is a classic vulnerable position, Richards explained after reviewing the situation. Your property has what we call an implied easement by necessity, but HOAs have become increasingly sophisticated at exploiting gray areas in access agreements. Together, we crafted what appeared to be standard deed language, but contained precise legal triggers. The clause was written in dense legal terminology that blended seamlessly with the surrounding document text. To an untrained eye skimming the document, it looked unremarkable. Paragraph 17. Subsection C stipulated that any restriction of property access would automatically activate specific remedies, including mandatory easement restoration, daily financial penalties of $500, and the option to pursue triple damages for all losses incurred. Most critically, this clause contained explicit acknowledgement that my property required uninterrupted access through HOA territory, with signatures from 3 board members. Most people do not read legal documents carefully, Richards had said. They look for key terms they recognize and skim the rest. The HOA representatives will likely focus on the standard access agreement language they are familiar with and overlook our additions. His prediction proved accurate. At closing, Margaret and the other board members had signed quickly, eager to complete the transaction. Not one of them requested time to review the documents thoroughly or consult their own attorney before signing. Now, with my access blocked, I carefully reviewed local laws and regulations that would strengthen my position. The county code explicitly prohibited landlocking properties through access restriction. State law protected easements by necessity as a fundamental property right. Most importantly, our state had strong contract enforcement provisions that upheld the validity of signed agreements regardless of whether all parties had read them thoroughly. I began building my legal case quietly, without alerting the HOA to my strategy. Each day, I documented the barriers with photographs, recorded instances of being denied access, and calculated financial damages from construction delays and temporary housing costs. My spreadsheets showed mounting losses that would eventually total tens of thousands of dollars. My cousin Robert arranged consultations with 3 additional attorneys who specialized in different aspects of property law. Each reviewed paragraph 17, subsection C, and confirmed its enforceability. "This is brilliantly crafted," said Ellen Thorne, a litigation specialist with 20 years of experience. "The language establishes both the necessity of access and the HOA's explicit acknowledgement of that necessity. Their signatures on this document create a binding contract with unambiguous terms." "What about their claim that they never noticed this provision?" I asked. "Irrelevant," Ellen replied confidently. "The law does not protect parties from their failure to read documents they sign. They had every opportunity to review the deed before signing. Their negligence does not invalidate the agreement." The third attorney specialized in HOA disputes specifically. After reviewing my documentation, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You have them cornered," he said. "Most people facing HOA bullying do not have your level of preparation. The financial penalties in this clause are entirely enforceable, especially given their deliberate actions to restrict your access." With legal confirmation secured, I began preparing the formal notice that would activate the clause. The document needed to be comprehensive, listing every violation with supporting evidence. Each day of denied access added to the potential damages. I worked methodically, organizing evidence chronologically and calculating financial impacts with precision. The HOA had made a critical error. They assumed I was an unprepared property owner who would capitulate under pressure. They had not realized I had consulted with multiple attorneys before purchasing. They never suspected that their casual signatures on what they thought was standard paperwork had created a binding contract with severe penalties for exactly the actions they were now taking. The HOA had not merely inconvenienced me, they had triggered a legal trap of their own making. Now it was time to spring it. Every great revenge requires meticulous preparation. The more thoroughly I documented the HOA's actions, the stronger my case would become. Each morning, I drove to the edge of the barriers and photographed them from multiple angles. I recorded videos showing the no trespassing signs, the security guards turning me away, and the impossible route that prevented me from reaching my own property. I maintained a detailed log of every interaction. When a security guard informed me I needed visitor authorization to proceed, I recorded the conversation on my phone. When I called the HOA office requesting temporary access to retrieve construction materials, I documented their refusal. These small pieces of evidence would create a compelling narrative of deliberate obstruction. My temporary relocation to a small apartment drained my savings rapidly. Construction loans continued accruing interest for a project now indefinitely paused. The financial strain was immense, but I channeled my anxiety into building an ironclad legal case. Every evening after work, I organized evidence and refined my strategy. Through a neighborhood social media group, I discovered I was not the first person to experience these tactics. A message to the group asking about Oak Hollow HOA practices yielded surprising results. 5 former property owners contacted me privately, each sharing similar stories of restricted access, manufactured violations, and eventual forced sales at below-market prices. "They blocked my driveway with maintenance equipment for weeks," wrote one former neighbor. "When I complained, They cited obscure regulations about approved access points that were not disclosed when I purchased my home. Another had faced escalating fines for alleged rule violations until financial pressure forced a sale. In each case, an entity connected to Oak Hollow had purchased the distressed property shortly afterward. With permission, I collected signed affidavits from these former owners, creating a pattern of predatory behavior that would strengthen my legal narrative. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A sympathetic former HOA board member who had resigned in protest over their tactics contacted me after hearing about my situation. We met at a coffee shop 20 miles away to avoid recognition. "Margaret has been planning the northern expansion for years," he explained, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Your property is the missing piece they need to complete Phase 3 of their development plan." Inside the envelope were printed copies of email exchanges between board members. The messages revealed Margaret explicitly discussing plans to squeeze out my property for their expansion project. The emails contained damning phrases like "force a distress sale" and "acquire at below market value once access is restricted." Most incriminating was an email from Margaret to the board treasurer. "The security measures are expensive, but once we acquire the landlocked parcel at discount, the ROI will be substantial. The owner has no viable options once access is restricted." My attorney's eyes widened when reviewing these documents. "This is evidence of deliberate, coordinated action to devalue your property through illegal means," he said. "Combined with the clause in your deed, we now have a devastatingly strong case." Financial preparation became equally important. I secured a personal loan to cover living expenses, knowing the legal process might take months. I sold my car and purchased a less expensive model to generate additional funds. Friends offered temporary housing to reduce my rental costs. These sacrifices were difficult but necessary for the long game I was playing. The strategic decision to wait for perfect timing was perhaps the hardest part. Robert advised against immediate legal action, suggesting instead that we allow the HOA to fully implement their access restrictions. Each day they maintained the barriers increased their liability under paragraph 17. Subsection C. Each email and board meeting about the restrictions added to our evidence of willful violation. "They believe you are powerless," Robert explained. "Let them become comfortable in that belief. Let them document their own violations through official board minutes and correspondence. When we finally reveal the clause, the impact will be maximized." 3 months passed this way. I watched my savings dwindle and my property sit inaccessible while maintaining meticulous records of every day of denied access. The strain affected my health, my work performance, and my relationships. Friends became concerned about my obsessive documentation and legal research. "You need to consider settling," one well-meaning friend suggested. "This fight is consuming your life." What my friend did not understand was that I was not merely seeking access restoration. The HOA's actions had revealed a systematic pattern of predatory behavior that had harmed multiple families before me. Their tactics needed to be exposed and stopped permanently. Paragraph 17 provided the means to do exactly that. By the end of the 3rd month, my evidence binder contained over 200 pages of documentation. The financial damages had reached 6 figures when accounting for construction delays, temporary housing, and other related expenses. Most importantly, the daily penalties specified in the deed had been accumulating for 93 days. The time had come to spring the trap. After 3 months of meticulous preparation, I instructed my attorney to deliver formal notice to each HOA board member. The document consisted of 15 pages of detailed legal analysis, supported by another 30 pages of evidence attachments. It meticulously detailed their violation of my access rights and formally activated the remedies outlined in paragraph 17, subsection C of our signed agreement. The notice demanded immediate restoration of access, payment of all accumulated penalties, and compensation for damages incurred. The final page specified a 7-day deadline for compliance before we would pursue legal action. My attorney delivered the documents by certified mail to ensure proper documentation of receipt. Their initial response arrived 3 days later via email. The message was brief and dismissive. Our legal department has reviewed your claims and finds your interpretation of the deed language creative but unfounded. The access restrictions remain in place per HOA policy. The response was exactly what I had expected. Margaret and her board remained confident in their position, unaware of the evidence we possessed beyond the deed itself. Their dismissal actually strengthened our case by demonstrating unwillingness to address the issue even when formally notified. 7 days after delivering our notice, I received an unexpected call from the HOA office. An emergency board meeting had been called to address property access concerns, and as an affected party, I was invited to attend. The meeting would take place that evening at 7 o'clock. I arrived at the Oak Hollow Community Center 15 minutes early, accompanied by my attorney. The parking lot contained more vehicles than I had ever seen at previous meetings. Word had spread about the confrontation, drawing curious homeowners who rarely attended board functions. The meeting room was arranged differently than usual. The board members sat behind a long table at the front, but now they were joined by an unfamiliar man in an expensive charcoal suit. He had silver hair and carried a leather portfolio embossed with the name of a prestigious law firm. Margaret called the meeting to order precisely at 7. Her voice lacked its usual confidence as she introduced the agenda: discussion of non-resident access claims and related legal matters. She then introduced the silver-haired man as Gerald Thornton, special counsel retained by the HOA for this matter. "Before we begin," my attorney interjected, "I would like to distribute copies of relevant documentation to all board members and residents present." Margaret started to object, but Thornton whispered something to her, and she reluctantly agreed. We distributed packets containing the deed with paragraph 17 highlighted, the email evidence from the former board member, and photographs documenting the access barriers. My attorney connected his laptop to the room's projector system. The screen illuminated with the first email exchange between Margaret and the board treasurer, discussing plans to squeeze out my property. The room fell silent as residents read the unambiguous language. "Let me direct your attention to the second page," my attorney said calmly. "This email explicitly states the intent to force a distress sale by restricting property access." Margaret's face transformed from confident dismissal to dawning horror as her own words appeared before the assembled residents. She attempted to interject, claiming the emails were taken out of context, but the evidence was too clear. The next slide displayed paragraph 17, subsection C from the deed, with the signatures of Margaret and 2 other board members clearly visible at the bottom. "This legally binding clause," my attorney explained to the room, "establishes my client's irrevocable right of access through Oak Hollow roads. It also establishes penalties of $500 per day for any access restriction, plus triple damages for all losses incurred as a result of such restriction." Thornton requested a brief recess to consult with the board privately. They retreated to a small office adjacent to the meeting room, but the walls were thin. Residents exchanged uncomfortable glances as raised voices carried through the partition. "You signed this without legal review," Thornton's voice demanded. It was buried in standard deed language. Margaret responded defensively. "This is not standard language," Thornton shot back. "This is one of the most precisely crafted penalty clauses I have ever seen." When they returned 15 minutes later, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Margaret avoided my gaze while Thornton addressed the room in a measured, professional tone. "The board acknowledges there appears to have been an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding AC.'s rights," he stated carefully. "We are interested in finding an amicable resolution that addresses all parties' concerns." "Our concerns are simple," my attorney responded. "Immediate restoration of full access rights, payment of all penalties accrued under paragraph 17, compensation for all damages incurred, and a permanent, recorded easement that prevents any future access restrictions." A resident in the back of the room raised her hand. "How much are these penalties so far?" My attorney displayed a spreadsheet on the screen. 93 days at $500 per day equals $46,500 in contractual penalties. Additional damages for temporary housing, construction delays, and other expenses currently total approximately $112,000. Under the triple damages provision, the total claim currently stands at $382,500. Audible gasps filled the room. Another resident stood up. "Are our HOA dues going to pay for this?" Thornton attempted to deflect the question, but the damage was done. Residents began asking pointed questions about the board's actions, the expansion plans, and whether other properties had been targeted with similar tactics. Margaret abruptly called for adjournment, citing the need for private legal consultation. As the meeting dissolved into concerned conversations among residents, Thornton approached us with a business card. "I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss settlement options tomorrow," he said quietly. "This situation has clearly escalated beyond what anyone intended." As we left the community center, I noticed several residents gathered around Margaret, their expressions ranging from confusion to anger. The trap had been sprung, and now they were desperately searching for escape from a predicament entirely of their own making. Their first settlement offer arrived via email the next morning: restoration of access rights and a $10,000 payment for inconvenience. The proposal characterized the access restriction as a good faith misunderstanding and required me to sign a confidentiality agreement preventing disclosure of the terms. My attorney responded with our full demand: immediate restoration of access, $150,000 in damages, removal of the responsible board members, and a permanent easement recorded with the county. We also demanded public disclosure of the settlement terms to all Oak Hollow residents. "They want to buy your silence," Robert explained. "The board is more afraid of the residents learning the truth than they are of the financial penalties." 3 days of negotiations followed. Each counterproposal from the HOA came closer to our terms, but they remained adamant about confidentiality. I refused to compromise on this point. The predatory pattern needed to be exposed to prevent future abuses. When negotiations stalled, we filed our lawsuit with the county court. The complaint included all evidence gathered over the preceding months: the emails revealing intentional efforts to force a distress sale, affidavits from previous victims, and comprehensive documentation of damages incurred. The case was assigned to Judge Wilson, a no-nonsense jurist with 20 years on the bench. The courtroom proceedings lasted 3 exhausting days. My attorney presented our evidence methodically, establishing the clear pattern of deliberate obstruction and the binding nature of paragraph 17. The HOA's defense strategy quickly became apparent. They claimed the clause had been slipped into standard documentation without proper notification. Margaret testified that she never fully read the documents she had signed, describing this as standard practice for routine property transactions. Judge Wilson removed his glasses and stared silently for an uncomfortable 30 seconds before asking, "Ms. Williams, do you routinely sign legal documents without reading them? Documents that bind your organization to specific obligations?" "We rely on our legal team for unusual provisions," she replied nervously. "This clause was not flagged for special attention." "Yet you signed it," Judge Wilson observed, "and you have served as HOA president for 7 years, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "During which time your organization has enforced strict compliance with HOA regulations against numerous homeowners, issuing fines for violations as minor as unapproved mailbox designs." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "Our covenants require uniform enforcement." "Indeed," the judge replied. "Uniform enforcement of rules is important, including those rules you agreed to when signing legal documents." The HOA's attorney attempted to argue that the penalties were unconscionably excessive, but their position weakened considerably when our evidence of deliberate, coordinated action was presented. The emails discussing P. lands to force a distress sale directly contradicted their claims of innocent oversight. On the final day, several Oak Hollow residents attended the proceedings. Their presence suggested the community had begun to question their leadership's actions. During a recess, one resident approached me. "We had no idea this was happening," she said quietly. "Many of us would never have supported these tactics." Judge Wilson delivered his ruling on a Tuesday morning. The courtroom remained silent as he methodically addressed each aspect of the case. "The court finds that paragraph 17, subsection C, constitutes a valid and enforceable contract provision," he stated clearly. "The signatures of authorized HOA representatives create a binding obligation regardless of whether they chose to read the document thoroughly." He continued, "Furthermore, the evidence presented demonstrates a deliberate and calculated effort to restrict property access for the purpose of forcing a distress sale. This constitutes not merely a breach of contract but bad faith dealing." The judgment was comprehensive. Judge Wilson ordered immediate restoration of access, payment of all contractual penalties, and triple damages for all losses incurred. Beyond the financial judgment, he ordered permanent recording of my easement rights with the county and a special notation requiring my written approval for any future access modifications. Most devastating to the HOA, he ordered them to cover all legal expenses and issued a strongly worded opinion that would be entered into public record, detailing the willful and calculated actions taken by the board. The court rarely sees such a clear example of attempted property appropriation through administrative means, Judge Wilson concluded. This judgment should serve as notice that such tactics will not be tolerated under the law. As we left the courtroom, Margaret and the other board members hurried toward a side exit, avoiding eye contact with the residents who had attended the proceedings. The judgment would cost the HOA over $400,000, money that would ultimately come from the community they claimed to serve. Justice had unfolded exactly as I had planned when I insisted on adding paragraph 17 to the deed a year earlier. The trap they had walked into was one of their own making. The concrete barriers disappeared overnight. Contractors arrived at dawn to restore the road access, now improved with proper drainage and fresh pavement, all at HOA expense. The no trespassing signs came down, replaced by new markers formally identifying the permanent easement protected by court order. The subsequent HOA meeting drew record attendance. Residents packed the community center, many standing along the walls when seats ran out. Margaret and 3 other board members submitted their resignations effective immediately. The treasurer read a prepared statement acknowledging serious errors in judgment and apologizing for actions that had damaged community finances and reputation. An interim board was elected from residents who had opposed the previous leadership's tactics. Their first official act was to commission an independent audit of HOA finances, including all legal settlements and property acquisitions over the previous 5 years. The settlement check arrived 30 days after the judgment, as ordered by the court. The funds covered my temporary housing costs, legal fees, and provided substantial compensation for the ordeal. Most importantly, a permanent easement was recorded with the county, protecting my access rights in perpetuity with specific language preventing any future modifications without my written consent. Construction on my home resumed immediately. The contractors returned, and within months, the structure that had sat weather-exposed and unfinished was finally complete. My property, once threatened, became my sanctuary once again. The case received significant local media attention. A newspaper investigation uncovered similar cases in other communities, prompting county commissioners to review HOA regulations. 6 months later, new protections were implemented for non-HOA properties adjacent to planned communities, specifically addressing access rights and easement protections. For months afterward, I received emails and letters from others facing similar situations, seeking advice on protecting their property rights. I always responded with the same essential guidance: document everything, research thoroughly before signing anything, and never underestimate the importance of carefully worded legal protections. The experience transformed my understanding of property ownership and community governance. I learned that justice requires not just righteous indignation but careful preparation, strategic patience, and meticulous documentation. The trap that saved my property was not merely clever legal language, but the comprehensive groundwork law. Before conflict even began. On the anniversary of receiving that first certified letter announcing the access restrictions, I sat on my completed back deck overlooking the creek. The setting sun filtered through oak branches, creating patterns on the wooden planks beneath my feet. In the distance, I could see new homes being constructed in Oak Hollow under the supervision of the reformed HOA board. The experience had taught me that patience, documentation, and proper legal preparation can overcome even the most determined adversaries. While I never wanted this conflict, standing firm against injustice restored not just my property access but my belief that one person, properly prepared, can find justice even against powerful interests. Sometimes I think about Margaret and wonder if she realizes the fundamental lesson of this experience. The trap they walked into was one of their own making, triggered by greed but sprung by the very legal system they tried to manipulate. In the end, justice prevailed not through confrontation alone, but through careful foresight and the power of the written word.